Hello one and hello all to the latest and greatest episode of the Global and the Granite State podcast, a program of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire. Welcome back to our longtime listeners as well as to those listening for the first time. As always, I am Tim Horgan, your host for this great program and the Executive Director of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire. What a wild ride we have been on since the last episode, as the new administration has worked to entirely reshape, dismantle, and fundamentally alter the U.S. relationship with the world. The Council remains committed to providing platforms for nonpartisan conversations on these important issues and highlighting well-researched information you can rely on. When you don't know where to turn to understand these complex issues, we aim to be that place. As a community-supported organization, I want to thank our members, donors, supporters, and sponsors for all you do to ensure these critical programs continue to engage our global community. If you believe in the work that we do, I hope you will take a moment to donate or become a member. A special thank you to McLean Middleton, our longtime series sponsor, for their vital leadership and support. McLean Middleton is one of New England's premier full-service law firms with over 115 attorneys throughout offices in New Hampshire and Massachusetts. McLean Middleton's attorneys have been providing trusted legal services to businesses throughout the region for over 100 years. Learn more at mclean.com. Now, let's dive into the realities of USAID. Okay, bit of real talk here, and a question for you. How many of you actually knew what USAID was doing around the world, or more specifically, that it even existed, prior to the past couple months when it shot into the headlines? Now, based on the fact that you are here listening to this conversation, I'm going to guess that more of you will answer yes to this question than the general public. However, the point remains that USAID was not a focal point for the vast majority of Americans. While I cannot find numbers on this, it is safe to say that the average American didn't know much of anything about it, as misperceptions around aid have pervaded the American conversation for decades. With majorities of Americans thinking that the U.S. spends 25% of its total budget on foreign aid, we have a clear disconnect between the perception and reality. At closer to 1/3 of 1% of the budget going to foreign aid, the messaging has a long way to go. In addition, there's a lot of confusion around the role of USAID, its programs, and the value it brings to the world and the country. We reached out to Charles Kenney, Senior Fellow at the Center for Global Development, to unravel this critical discussion the United States has been having. He's a contributing editor to Foreign Policy, the author of 3 books focused on global development, and a regular contributor to Business Week. Previously, he worked at the World Bank, where he worked on a number of investment, anti-corruption, and development projects. You can check out his full bio in the episode description. So, let's start off with an understanding of where USAID came from and what it is tasked with doing.
USAID was founded by John F. Kennedy, and back in the day using an executive order to create the agency. It sort of rested under state and has pretty much sort of remained there, but in the last couple of decades been written into legislation. So it's a sort of formal agency of the US government and headed by an administrator who's said it confirmed and so on. And it's grown into the world's largest aid agency, largest bilateral aid agency anyway, doing a whole range of projects, a lot of global health projects, a lot of projects in education, anti-terrorism, projects around democracy promotion and so on, just across a range of different fields around the world with a staff that was of thousands and a lot of contractors, both in the United States, but also in developing countries, delivering services to people.
This seems like a lot of topics to cover, especially when it is spread out across the world. As I mentioned at the top, this is funded through the U.S. budget at 1/3 of 1% of the total. But what does that really mean? How much has the U.S. government been spending on this work?
It's billions, it's tens of billions. It's somewhere around 60 billion in the last few years, I think. Sounds like a lot. It is a lot. It can do an immense amount of good. It is also less than 1% of the federal budget. So the US is a big country with a very big federal government, and this is a very small part of that very big federal government. I think it's worth putting it in other terms at the same time, though. This aid finance is doing many things, but one of the things it's doing is providing support for life-saving medicines and drugs and supplies. And it is no exaggeration to say that it is keeping millions of people alive each year. And the cost of keeping each person alive is tiny on any global scale. It's a few $1,000s. It's nothing compared to how much we spend in order to save lives in the United States, where the regulated amount is at the low end. It's worth saving a life if you have to spend $1 million. That's the value of a life saved that we're willing to spend on regulation in the States at the low end. If you're getting on a plane, it's one life saved for hundreds of millions of dollars. So we're willing to spend that much to save a life. What USAID and the US assistance system is doing is delivering lives saved at 0.1% of that. It's an incredibly effective tool just to do that one thing. And it's doing a whole load of other stuff as well as just saving lives, right? It's building infrastructure, it's making kids learn more in school, it's doing a whole load of other things. But just looking at that one part of it, it's doing it at a really low cost, in a very effective way.
Okay, $63 billion is a bit of a rounding error when it comes to the federal budget, but it's still a lot of money for a lot of people to wrap their heads around. We want to be prudent with how we spend all of the American taxpayers' dollars and ensure that there is reasonable return on investment. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has indicated that any U.S. program that connects the country to the world has to answer the three questions of does it make us more secure, more safe, or more prosperous. Does USAID fit this mold, or is it simply something we have done out of the goodness of our hearts for the past 60 plus years?
I think it's both. I think it is important to remember the moral case here. Americans are generous people in their charitable donations. They have long been outward facing and realized that we have responsibilities to the rest of the world. And I think that PEPFAR, the program sort of run by state and USAID together that provides life-saving antiretroviral drugs in order to prevent HIV turning into full-blown AIDS, and is very effective program keeping millions of people alive. The case for that, there is a really strong moral case. It's just the right thing to do. People shouldn't be dying of easily preventable conditions anywhere in the world, and that's something that Americans have stood behind. Republicans, Democrats have stood behind that idea, and I think it's a really important idea. But it's not just about morality and sort of doing the right thing. It is very much also about self-interest. Take the great work that the US finances around tuberculosis, for example. Now, consumption was a disease that killed millions in the United States in the 19th century. It still kills a lot of people in the United States, kills many more people worldwide. If we can reduce the global burden, we reduce the risk to the United States of more tuberculosis spreading. And in particular, we reduce the risk of multi-drug resistant tuberculosis. What that is, if people are on treatment and then they go off treatment from tuberculosis, the TB in their system can develop resistance to the first line drugs we use against it. And then you have to use much more expensive drugs in order to fix it. That problem is spreading. And by the way, pausing support for TB programs makes it spread faster. And that problem, if it comes to the United States, is going to cost the US billions a year. And so our support for programs overseas to prevent the spread of tuberculosis does this immense amount of good at. So does the goodwill we build up with countries by keeping some of their citizens alive. So does the support for democracy promotion that means we're dealing with a few fewer. It doesn't always work, but we're dealing with a few fewer authoritarians and a few more democracies. That helps our security. The countries that are low income, the poorest countries in the world, are multiple times more likely to fall into civil war than richer countries. And civil wars open up opportunities for all sorts of bad actors. There was a reason that Osama bin Laden was in Afghanistan. It was a place where he could build up his forces in the chaos of a low-income country in civil war. So for all sorts of reasons, it is definitely in the US national interest to see a stronger, safer, more pacific, richer world. It has huge long-term payoffs to the United States.
However, long-term thinking is not something that pervades Washington, D.C. when elected officials are thinking about 4- and 6-year election cycles. This produces a lot of questions around, what have you done for me lately? This has also led to people on both sides of the aisle who want to draw back from the world and focus more inwardly to question the value of this spending. One of their favorite lines of attack against these programs is the idea of waste, fraud, or abuse of funds. Many Americans have been led to believe that any money we send overseas has little to no oversight, that it is sucked up by corrupt government officials, and that the people who need the support are not receiving it. One recent case is the aid that the U.S. has provided to Ukraine over the past 3 years since the second invasion by Russia in 2022.
U.S. foreign assistance has always had a lot of detractors on Capitol Hill and beyond who quite quickly get to pointing at waste, fraud, and abuse as an issue. Actually, as a result of that, for a long time, there has been a huge amount of oversight of U.S. foreign assistance spending. Let me just take one recent example, which is the support that runs through USAID to the World Bank, to the Ukrainian government, to people in Ukraine. We have, at every step of that process, forensic auditing going on, immense amount of oversight. And the last step, the step sort of through the Ukrainian government to the final recipients of this money, USAID, quite rightly, has sponsored a whole load of surveys to go out and ask people, did you get the money you were meant to get from the Ukrainian government to support you to do this, that, and the other, that, went through the Ukrainian government, came from the World Bank, originally started at USAID. Those surveys suggest all the money got to within, a rounding error of 0.0 something percent. So we know that the money got where it was meant to go because we are very concerned about waste, fraud, and abuse. And the US government has a whole load of systems to prevent that. And one of the interesting things about the oversight mechanisms that report on US assistance, things like the special investigator generals, is that when they come to do their reports on US foreign assistance, they point out issues and concerns there. We can't track all of this money as well as we might be able to. We don't have all of the data we might want. By golly, it would be better if this system was better. What you hardly ever actually see is, look, we found this case of fraud. We found this case of corruption. I'm not saying never. I'm saying at fractions of a percent do they find that kind of thing. And again, I think it points to the fact that there's just not very much of it going on because we have a system that has been very carefully designed, I think over-designed, to avoid issues of fraud and corruption.
Interestingly, because there have been so many layers of oversight in place for these programs at USAID, Charles actually sees it as an area that could be reduced to improve efficiency while maintaining a high level of oversight.
There is an immense amount of oversight and bureaucracy to make sure that this money doesn't fall into the wrong hands, isn't wasted, isn't subject to fraud, isn't subject to corruption, and so on. And while I think that has the benefit of meaning there is really not very much fraud or corruption in the US foreign assistance system, it makes for an immense amount of paperwork and really rather complicated rules. And so one of the sort of big services that the US-based contractors provide is, frankly, they have the knowledge to understand how to fill in all of these forms and to make sure that the processes are all followed to the last dotted I and the last crossed T. And so it's a sort of heavy overhead system, which does, again, have the benefit of helping make sure that all of the money gets where it's meant to go, but does require this sort of large number of people basically spending their lives filling in forms and making sure processes are followed. I think we could move away from that system somewhat to more of a system like the World Bank uses, where there's still a lot of oversight, but much more it's about funneling resources to governments to provide services that are agreed by the World Bank and the government. This is what the money will be used for, rather than trying to operate through a sort of chain of contract.
While we are at it, another area for reform could be removing the reliance on U.S. service contractors, farmers, shipping companies, and others to provide this aid. Moving massive amounts of farm goods from the middle part of the country to shipping ports and then on to places halfway around the world takes time and adds costs, as well as creates dependencies that don't address root causes. When you have people starving in Sudan today due to the ongoing conflict there are probably closer places that this food could be sourced from, and the savings could be reinvested into stabilizing local food sources in the future. However, there has been a traditional advantage to this system from an American perspective.
From a political standpoint, one of the reasons that part of the system seems to be comparatively free of disruption at the moment is because it does build up political support within the United States for humanitarian. So I guess there's that trade-off, if you will.
We will see what those local constituencies have to say, as over $500 million worth of U.S. agricultural products were at risk of spoiling in warehouses due to the freeze alone. Beyond that, USAID in recent years has purchased over $2.1 billion in American farm goods for international responses, which throws a once reliable source of farm funding into uncertainty. Many farmers have spoken out about the impact this will have on their ability to maintain their farms, as well as the poor timing of this all, as they have just planted their crops and now are not sure who will buy them. Okay, so we've covered the fraud and corruption side of things, with very little evidence of that happening. But what about the waste side of things?
One person's waste is another person's good expenditure. I happen to think aircraft carriers are not a terribly useful tool in the modern military arsenal and would call spending money on aircraft carriers a bit of a waste. Other people might disagree, right? The same is true within the aid system. Some projects, some people may not like the look at. Projects around gender equality seem to have come in for a lot of heat from this administration when it comes to US spending. I happen to think that's a good way to spend money. We disagree. But that's not about the system's not working. It's not about corruption. It's not about fraud. It's about, policy differences over what matters. And sure, there's a lot of that in the aid system, but it's a very different problem.
Okay, now let's dive into a couple of the programs that the administration has held up to show the problems with USAID and how it is spending taxpayer dollars. As a part of the administration's efforts to justify the shuttering of this program, they outlined 12 projects that they say were emblematic of wasteful government spending. From DEI initiatives in Serbia to musicals, comic books, and LGBTQ issues, New Hampshire Native and Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt indicated that she does not want her tax dollars going to this quote-unquote crap. Okay, difference of opinion, but let's dive into this a bit. In their own press release about this, the links to the supporting documentation for the first 4 programs go to the same Daily Mail article, simply reporting on the Trump administration canceling these programs. Another 6 link to articles on various websites, none of them associated with the government. The only program that links back to an actual U.S. government website is for their claim of $6 million going to Egypt for tourism. Now, that page, along with most all of the other USAID pages, has been taken down. However, the link information still remains, indicating that this press release came from December 16th, 2019. By using the internet's Wayback Machine, we can see that this press release did not mention tourism at all, but rather infrastructure projects and economic livelihood programs. Well, Tim, some people may say, they probably just linked to the wrong thing. People make mistakes. Okay, fine. We'll skip over the fact that we were promised quick corrections to anything they got wrong, and this link still remains there about a month later. And I am willing to share with you here that, yes, it does appear that they simply linked to the wrong thing. In 2024, USAID did disperse $6.8 million to Family Health International 360, a US-based organization, which, full disclosure, we work with them on the International Visitor Leadership Program and previously on the Open World Leadership Program. And this money was to, and I quote, increase tourism revenues and local economic benefits, including increased employment and business opportunities in the cultural tourism sector at targeted destinations. Wow, Tim must be really tied in to be able to discover this information and be able to bring it to light. No. I do not have any special access to USAID databases, nor did anyone pass me troves of documents to share with you, and I wouldn't even know where to begin to try and hack into anything. I have a hard enough time getting into my own password-protected accounts these days. As a matter of fact, I found this information on the freely accessible foreignassistance.gov website, where you can dive into all the ways in which USAID and other government agencies have spent money on, you guessed it, foreign assistance. This tracks things down to the dollar. Yes, I have seen entries that are for as little as $1. So, time for me to wrap up my rant here with the big finish. Anyone who is telling you that USAID is some sort of secretive, clandestine, non-transparent organization is not being transparent themselves. Anyone, and I mean anyone, can go and look at these contracts, research what they are doing, and gain insights into how your taxpayer dollars have been spent. This leads me to one big question that everyone should answer for themselves. If you are now so concerned about how USAID has spent your money, where have you been for the past 4, 8, 10, 60 years? During 2019, under the first Trump administration, there were at least 7 USAID and State Department grants totaling over $1.1 million to LGBTQ initiatives around the world. Where was the outcry then? How can I easily find this information and somehow the Trump administration would not have known about it? Again, you can answer these questions for yourself, but for me, they lead to an even bigger question about what is really going on now. In addition, based on these highlighted programs, and there are more than just 12 from this press release, are we throwing the proverbial baby out with the bathwater here?
There has been a real disconnect between the stated problem and the enacted solution. The stated problem, you sort of add up all of the contracts that the White House has complained about, and it's a fraction of a percentage of US foreign assistance programs. Many of them aren't even run by USAID. We have this problem where the evidence for the problem amounts to 0 point something percent of the program, but the actual response has been to keep more than 90% of staff out of the office, to actually shut the office down and move the remaining staff to another building, putting everybody in the field, in the USAID, offices in developing countries, saying you can't go to work either, and we're going to bring you home. Don't care if your kids are in school, none of that. We're just going to bring you home. We are seeing 90% of the number of contracts certainly be terminated in a process where the maximum amount of time that could have been spent over deciding on each contract was a little over a minute. That's if they were working 24 hours a day. So you can't feel like that was a terribly deep investigation of what contracts they were cutting compared to what they were saving. I'm hoping that 90% number is lower when it comes to value, but we can't tell because we have no information about which contracts have actually been cut. So we're in a state of absolute confusion, and I think it would be naive to say that that state of absolute confusion wasn't meant to happen. I think it is part of the process was to create this sense of absolute confusion. It is definitely leading, for all that there have been waivers in place for life-saving assistance, it is definitely leading to a lot of that life-saving assistance not being delivered. And that means it is definitely leading to deaths. It's hard to know exactly how many. And there have been, desperate efforts by providers to find other sources of funds, other sources of drugs and so on. But we know sort of over the medium term, it's definitely going to lead to thousands, quite possibly millions of deaths. So it's a chronically sad moment where on the basis of stories about $10,000 worth of money being spent on comics, we are denying mothers antiretrovirals which will stop their children being born with HIV and dying of AIDS 6 months later.
So, after all those depressing thoughts of the damage being done around the world by the cancellation of this work, is there any hope for a brighter future?
I honestly believe that Secretary Rubio is somebody who knows the value of foreign aid and foreign assistance and appreciates its life-saving properties. He has stood up and made eloquent speeches when he was a senator on why PEPFAR mattered, why assistance mattered for US national security and so on. I mean, I can only believe that he's not in charge of this and that other elements of the administration who just really don't think the US should be doing foreign assistance at all are running the show. And what I hope is that we get back to a situation where Secretary Rubio gets to be in charge of what he should be in charge of, given that he is the Senate confirmed Secretary of State, who's going to be overseeing all of this. And Congress comes back and actually does its role of oversight and making sure that the money it appropriates gets spent in the way that it should do. I hope the system comes back to functioning again in a way that means that rather than millions of lives being lost because of its dysfunction, it's only thousands. That's what I'm hoping for right now.
How do we, as individuals, get involved to make our voices heard, whether you are in support of this life-saving work or prefer to leave the world to fend for itself? Charles has a few suggestions.
Please contact your senators and your congresspeople. I do think this is a moment where there's a lot of misunderstanding about what is going on. So, for example, there was a recent House hearing on USAID and its functions and dysfunctions. At the opening, a bunch of activists stood up and said, "Stop PEPFAR, pause." And the chairman of the committee said, well, these people are clearly ignorant. They don't know that there's a waiver in effect for PEPFAR. Well, the point is the waiver isn't working. And so the more noise we can make about the fact that what the administration says is happening isn't working on the ground, hopefully the sooner this gets fixed.
In addition, if you found this episode of The Global in the Granite State helpful to your understanding of USAID, the challenges, the opportunities, as well as helpful to clarifying some of this for you, please do share it out with your friends, family, and community. Again, we can agree to disagree on certain aspects of where this money has been spent. However, if you are one of the 68% of Americans who in 2019 said the U.S. should increase or maintain its U.S. foreign aid commitments, it is important to utilize your voice. Thank you for listening to this month's episode of The Global in the Granite State, a production of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire. If you liked it, please share, like, subscribe, and comment on this episode. You can also listen back to our library of global conversations from the past several years. Thank you for your engagement and interest. As always, Tim Horgan takes care of all the areas needed to make this podcast possible. Our intro music remains admin by AA Alto, and our interlude music is Uncharted Roads by Free Sound Server. Hope you'll join us next month.